Dusk fell over the town, and the old church bell rang out its final warning of death. Its sound echoed through the empty streets, crashing against the old houses that stood as gloomy, silent witnesses to the event. The sky grew heavy, filled with black clouds that were about to pour down rain. The funeral procession moved toward the church, and something more than mere sorrow was written on the faces of the people. It was fear. Those who had gathered carried the coffin in silence, only occasionally exchanging glances. A cold wind suddenly rose, howling through the trees, and it seemed as if it was trying to say something, but its words were only a whisper. A faint knock came from the coffin, draped in dark cloth. It was just the sound of wooden planks scraping against each other, but people exchanged glances, and a few quickly crossed themselves. When the coffin was finally carried into the church, the air was filled with the sweet, almost suffocating scent of burning candles. Their dim flame fought against the darkness that was slowly creeping in, taking over every corner of the room. In the front row stood the widow, her tear-filled eyes fixed on the coffin. But even through her tears, she could not hide the fear that hung in her eyes. During the service, every word the priest said sounded somehow muffled, as if his voice was lost in an invisible void. As he said the last prayer, the church doors suddenly creaked open by themselves. A cold wind rushed in, extinguishing several candles, and the remaining ones trembled, creating ghostly shadows on the walls. Someone in the crowd whispered, "This is a bad sign. He doesn't want to go." No one answered, but everyone felt it, an invisible presence that seemed to be watching them from the darkness. And when the priest asked the people to disperse, many hurried to leave the church without looking back. The next day, a strange silence hung over the church. The birds that usually sat on the bell tower disappeared, leaving room for a raven that stared fixedly at the door. Its eyes, shining like black obsidian, gave the impression that it knew something that the others didn't. When I entered the church, an eerie feeling came over me. The air was thick, heavy, and it seemed that even the sunlight refused to penetrate the colored stained glass windows. The candles I had lit the day before had somehow burned out completely, although they always lasted several days. I stood at the altar, preparing for the morning service, and suddenly I heard a creak. It was the sound of someone walking on a wooden floor. I looked around, but I saw no one. Instead, I felt a chill creep up my spine, and I saw the curtains hanging outside the confessional move slightly, although there was no wind. I approached the confessional, trying to find the source of the sound. The feeling of tension grew with each step, and when I finally opened the door, my heart almost stopped. There was no one inside, only darkness that seemed thicker than it should be. "Father," a voice came from the depths of the confessional, weak and whispering, as if from another world. I took a step back, feeling fear paralyze my limbs. But the voice did not stop. It grew louder and louder, enveloping me like a thick fog. "You opened the door, and now it will not close." I ran out of the church, leaving the door open. The feeling of being followed me all the way home. And all night long I heard the church bell ringing in the distance, although I knew for sure that no one had touched it. This evening, the house was eerily quiet. The candles on the windowsills, which I had lit for warmth and light, burned strangely dimly, as if something had stolen their fire. In the old living room, among the furniture long since covered with dust and the veils of time, stood a mirror. This mirror had always seemed unusual to me. Its blackened wooden frame looked as if it had absorbed someone's story, and it was a story full of pain. That night, I noticed that the mirror seemed to have fogged up. I went over to wipe the dust, but when I touched the glass, I realized that it was cold, almost icy. As I stared into the reflection, I saw more than just myself. For a second, it seemed that someone's figure flashed over my shoulder, pale as fog, with empty eyes. I turned sharply, but the room was empty. Instead of calming myself with logical explanations, I felt fear grip me. The mirror began to make a faint sound, similar to a whisper. I could not make out the words, but it seemed to be talking to me. The whisper became louder and louder, and suddenly I heard my own name. "Come here." The sound was gentle but insistent. I had no strength left to resist. My gaze was fixed on the reflection. I saw the figure in the mirror approaching me, although there was no one in the room. It moved slowly but surely, and with each step it took, the glass seemed to crack from the inside. At that moment, the candles suddenly went out, leaving me in absolute darkness. The only source of light was the mirror, in which a faint, ghostly glow shone. And then I heard the last sound, a crash, as if something had been broken free from the mirror. The next morning, I decided to leave the house. However, as I walked out through the old wooden porch, I thought I was being followed. The footsteps were quiet, but their rhythm matched my own. I turned around, but all I saw was an empty courtyard, shrouded in a thick morning mist. The path to the village led through the forest, and I could feel the forest breathing. The old trees stood silent, their bare branches like bony hands trying to reach me. The air was thick with moisture, and every step made a dull crunch underfoot. But the worst part was that the sounds of my own footsteps seemed distant. Halfway through, I heard laughter, childish, sonorous, but the kind that made my hair stand on end. Looking back, I saw only a thick fog, which now seemed alive, moving, drawing closer together. And again the footsteps behind me became louder. When I reached the edge of the forest, I saw a figure standing between the trees. It was a woman, seemingly covered entirely with a black veil, which moved as if something lived under it. Her face was covered, but a feeling of all-consuming cold emanated from her. "Don't go any further," she said, but her voice seemed to come from different directions at once. I froze in place, feeling the air around me grow heavier. She slowly raised her hand, pointing in the direction of the village. But I noticed that in the direction she was pointing, there was only fog. And when I tried to take a step back, I heard something heavy breathing behind me. The sound was so close that it seemed as if someone was bending over my ear. And then I realized it wasn't the forest breathing. It was something waiting for me here, in its very heart. Back at the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Every corner felt a little different, as if the walls had shifted in the night, changing the layout. I didn't want to stay here, but the thick fog surrounding the house left me no choice. Determined to find some peace, I went up to the second floor. There was a room I had never noticed before. The door was half open, and a faint melody was coming from it. A low, old grand piano was playing notes that carried the weight of time and forgotten stories. As I entered, I saw the grand piano standing in the middle of the room, covered in dust, but with its lid open. The notes spread out on the music stand were written over with black paint that resembled dried blood. I felt my hands tremble as I touched the keys. Suddenly, the melody stopped, although I was sure that no one had touched the instrument. Looking up, I noticed the mirror on the wall opposite. It was huge, old, and its surface was covered with small cracks that looked like cobwebs. In the reflection, the room looked different. The walls were torn, and dark slime was oozing from the corners. And the worst thing, in the mirror I saw myself, but with pale, haggard skin and a look of horror. I stepped back, and the reflection did the same, but with a delay that seemed unnatural. At that moment, something began to scrape the door from the outside. The sound was slow and piercing, like nails scraping wood. I couldn't breathe as the door slowly opened. In the darkness of the corridor, I saw a silhouette. It was human, but it looked as if its body had been twisted. His arms were too long, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. As I took a step back, the mirror suddenly fell, shattering into hundreds of pieces. Instead of shattering, the pieces rose into the air, creating a vortex around me. And I heard a whisper, "You shouldn't have come in here." The night seemed longer than usual. I tried to leave the house, but the door was firmly locked. The key I had put in my pocket had disappeared. All the windows seemed to be closed by an invisible force. I returned to the living room, where the only source of light was the fireplace. But the fire in it had long since died down. It only smoldered, emitting a faint smoke. I felt the room begin to cool. Each breath was heavy, as if I were breathing not air, but mist that had seeped in through the cracks in the walls. Sitting by the fireplace, I heard heavy footsteps overhead. They were extremely slow, but the echoes from them made the walls tremble. Each sound made my heart beat faster and faster. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind, but the dull knock did not stop. When I went up to the second floor, I saw that the door to one of the rooms was ajar. Heavy breathing could be heard from there. A cold sweat ran down my back from this sound. Gathering my strength, I looked inside. There was nothing in the room except a shadow that froze in the center, slowly dissolving in the darkness. I turned my back on the room and tried to quickly go downstairs, but the footsteps I had heard before were now right behind me. I could not see who it was, but I felt a cold breath on the back of my head. When I went down to the living room, I saw that the candles on the table had lit up by themselves, but their fire was black, emitting shadow instead of light. I stood in the center of the room, not knowing where to run. Silhouettes began to appear from all sides, emerging from the shadows. Their faces were distorted, and their eyes were blazing red. They whispered something incomprehensible, but their whispers grew louder and louder. And then something more emerged from the darkness. It was not human. Its outline was vague, but every muscle and every movement radiated menace. Its eyes met mine, and I felt time stand still. This was what had been waiting for me from the beginning, something that would not let go. During the funeral, which took place late at night, the church was plunged into semi-darkness. A cold fog lay on the ground, enveloping the old tombstones like a blanket of oblivion. The people, dressed in black, listened silently to my words. I felt a boa constrictor tighten my chest. Every word I uttered seemed hollow, as if the air were being squeezed out of me along with the prayer. When the service was over and I was descending to the grave to bless the final resting place, I saw him. A man with black eyes stood in the shade of an old tree at the edge of the cemetery. He was dressed in a dark coat, but that could not hide his incredibly pale skin. His figure was still, but a strange vibration emanated from him, like a shadow flickering under the starry sky. My voice trembled as I continued my service, but the stranger's gaze would not leave me. When I finished, I could not bear it and went closer to the tree, but the man was no longer visible. I looked around, silence. Only the slow crack of a branch underfoot cut through this abyss. Then I heard a whisper. "The door is open. You did everything that was necessary." His voice rang in my head, as if mixing words with an ominous hiss. I turned, and he was standing a few steps away from me. His black eyes shone with hatred and at the same time with a cold, inhuman joy. "What door? What do you mean?" I asked, although my heart clenched with horror. He simply smiled, a smile that showed too many teeth, long and sharp like a predator's. Before I could do anything, he disappeared into the thick fog, leaving me alone among the tombstones. The encounter left me confused, and his last words remained a mystery that gnawed at me from the inside. A cold winter night enveloped the church in a silent blackness. I sat in my office, going through my notes and preparing for the morning service, when I heard a faint sound like small footsteps. The clock showed well past midnight, and the church should have been empty. The sounds led me to the confessional. I approached slowly, trying not to show the fear that gripped me. In the dim candlelight, I saw a small figure. A girl sat in the confessional, her dark hair matted and her pale skin like marble. Her dress looked old-fashioned, but what caught my attention most were her eyes. They were empty, without luster, and seemed eerily still. "Father, I have come to confess," she whispered in a weak voice that could barely be heard. I took a seat in the confessional, my heart pounding, but duty compelled me to stay. Her voice was childish and innocent, but the words she uttered made my blood run cold. I saw something I was not supposed to see, something that lurks in the shadows, something that you let in. It is here with us now. Suddenly, her voice changed. It became deep, loud, one that seemed to fill the entire confessional and swallow it up. "You cannot save them. You have already lost." I hurried to open the door, but the girl was gone. She had disappeared as suddenly as she had appeared. Only a cold breath of wind that suddenly penetrated the room made me realize that I was still there. The whispers continued to echo around me, as if ghosts lived within the walls of the confessional. And from that moment on, I no longer dared to stay alone in the church at night.